Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, May 9th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside today will reach a high of 80.1 degrees and a low of 58.4 degrees, making for quite a comfortable Saturday. Moving into our top stories, we are carefully tracking the situation as Russia and Ukraine initiate a fragile 3-day ceasefire and discussing what to watch for as that situation unfolds. We will also be investigating why the Trump administration is allowing industrial polluters to circumvent federal air regulations and the potential consequences of those policy changes. We have a variety of other important news stories to cover as well to keep you fully informed. Stay tuned for all of this and much more right here on Alex's News. Good morning, everyone. We're following a major development out of Eastern Europe today, where a fragile 3-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine has officially taken effect. The deal was brokered directly by U.S. President Donald Trump, and it's already being tested. For more, we're joined by our reporter Ethan. Ethan, good morning. Can you walk us through what this ceasefire actually is?
Good morning, Grace. So this truce kicked off today, May 9th, and it's scheduled to run through Monday, May 11th. President Trump announced it on social media just yesterday, saying he made the request directly to Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. According to NPR, Trump said both leaders agreed, quote, readily, end quote, and he's calling this a possible, quote, beginning of the end, end quote, of a war now entering its 5th year.
A beginning of the end is a bold claim. How are diplomats actually framing this moment?
Cautiously, to be honest. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters in Rome that earlier U.S. mediation efforts had, quote, stagnated, end quote. But this specific 72-hour window is the first time in over a year that both sides have formally accepted a mutual humanitarian pause. The agreement was confirmed publicly by President Zelensky and by Yuri Ushakov, a foreign affairs advisor to President Putin, so it does carry weight on paper.
Let's get into the substance. What did each side actually agree to?
There are essentially two pillars here, Grace. First, a full 72-hour halt to offensive and defensive combat operations across the entire 1,100-kilometer front line. And second, the real centerpiece, a massive prisoner of war exchange. We're talking 1,000 prisoners from each side, 2,000 people total. That reporting comes from NPR, PBS NewsHour, and the BBC.
2,000 prisoners going home. That's enormous. Is that what convinced Ukraine to sign on?
It really does seem to be the driving factor. President Zelensky emphasized that the return of these prisoners was Ukraine's primary motivation for participating. He's been under pressure from families for months. And on Telegram, Zelensky said, quote, Red Square matters less to us than the lives of Ukrainian prisoners of war who can be brought home, end quote. That line is really telling about Kyiv's priorities here.
You mentioned Red Square. That ties into the timing of all this, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and the timing is no accident. May 9th is Russia's Victory Day, marking the 81st anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. It's the most important patriotic holiday on the Russian calendar. NPR and the BBC reported that Moscow and St. Petersburg were placed on high alert leading up to the holiday, with residents warned about limited mobile internet access and potential outages for security reasons.
And Zelensky actually issued some kind of decree about the parade?
He did, and it raised eyebrows. Zelensky issued a formal presidential decree, quote, authorizing, end quote, Russia to hold its Victory Day parade and declaring Red Square off-limits for Ukrainian strikes during the event. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov dismissed it as a, quote, silly joke, end quote, but Zelensky was making a clear point. The prisoners matter more than the symbolism.
How did the parade itself look this year?
Strikingly different, Grace. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the BBC and the Moscow Times reported that no military hardware was on display. No tanks, no armored vehicles rolling through Red Square. Russian officials claimed the equipment was, quote, needed on the battlefield, end quote. So even with the ceasefire providing breathing room, the optics of Russian military strength took a real hit.
Now, you mentioned the truce is already being tested. What are we hearing about violations?
Quite a lot, unfortunately. Independent reports from the BBC, The Guardian, and United 24 Media indicate the suspension of kinetic activity was breached within hours of the midnight deadline. The Ukrainian Air Force says Russia launched an Iskander-M ballistic missile and 43 drones overnight. 34 were intercepted, but impacts were recorded in 6 locations across the country.
Were there civilian casualties?
Yes, and that's the most heartbreaking part. In the Zaporizhzhia region, Governor Ivan Fedorov reported that a Russian FPV drone struck a civilian car on the morning of May 9th. A 67-year-old driver was killed, and 2 others were injured. So within hours of a ceasefire meant to spare civilians, we already have a confirmed civilian death.
And what is Russia saying about all this?
Moscow is pushing back with its own accusations. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed it provided a, quote, mirror response, end quote, to Ukrainian strikes on civilian targets in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin also reported that roughly 20 drones were downed near the capital in just the first 2 hours of the ceasefire. So both sides are pointing fingers, and both are claiming the other broke the deal first.
What about the front lines themselves? Has the fighting actually slowed?
Partially. Intelligence from the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, indicates that while large-scale maneuvers have slowed considerably, artillery fire and drone activity are continuing in the Slovyansk and Kupiansk sectors. So you've got a kind of patchwork situation, Grace. Some areas quiet, others still active. It's not a clean stop to the fighting by any stretch.
Given all those violations, where does the prisoner swap stand right now?
As of midday today, the 1,000 for 1,000 exchange has officially entered its implementation phase. Kyiv Post and the Moscow Times are reporting that logistics are in motion at designated border crossing points. President Trump's administration is acting as the guarantor of the deal, and U.S. officials reportedly met with Ukrainian representatives in Miami earlier this week to finalize the details.
But could those continued violations derail the swap itself?
That's the real concern. The fog of war and these localized violations have already slowed the process. Commanders on both sides are maintaining what they're calling a, quote, principle of symmetry, end quote, warning that any significant escalation could halt the humanitarian transfer entirely. So those 2,000 prisoners and their families are essentially hostage to the broader military situation right now.
Stepping back a bit, are analysts viewing this as a real diplomatic breakthrough or something more cynical?
There's a lot of skepticism, Grace. Geopolitical analysts from Stratfor and the BBC are questioning whether this is genuine progress or a tactical security measure. For Putin, the truce provided breathing room to conduct a sensitive national holiday without the embarrassment of a strike on the Kremlin. For Trump, it's a high-profile diplomatic win he can showcase as active engagement in ending the war.
And the historical track record for these kinds of pauses?
Frankly, it's poor. Similar unilateral ceasefires earlier in May 2026 and an, quote, Easter truce, end quote, back in April of 2025, collapsed within hours. The Washington Post and other outlets have noted that Russia has been accused of using these pauses to rotate exhausted units and replenish ammunition stocks. So there's a real worry this becomes another tactical breather rather than a turning point.
So what should viewers be watching for over the next 48 hours?
2 big things, Grace. First, whether that prisoner swap actually completes. If those 2,000 people make it home, that alone is a humanitarian win, regardless of what happens next. And second, whether the ceasefire actually holds through Monday, May 11th, when Victory Day commemorations wrap up. If it collapses before then, this gets remembered as just another transactional pause in a war that keeps defying resolution.
And if it does hold, could it lead to something bigger?
That's the open question. Trump clearly wants to use this as a launching pad for broader negotiations, but the underlying issues, territorial control, security guarantees, Ukraine's future alignment, none of that has been touched here. This is a 72-hour pause and a prisoner swap, not a peace framework. Any larger deal would require months of work that simply hasn't happened yet.
Ethan, really thorough reporting on a fast-moving story. Thanks so much for breaking it all down for us this morning.
Happy to do it, Grace. We'll keep watching as the day develops.
That was our reporter Ethan with the latest on the 3-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. We'll have more news right after this. And now to our second story this morning. A growing fight over how the nation's biggest polluters are getting around federal air quality rules. Joining me now is our environmental reporter, Chloe. Chloe, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. Yes, this is a story that's been building for years, but it's really come to a head this week. The Trump administration is facing a wave of legal challenges and congressional pressure over a regulatory system that lets industrial polluters essentially opt out of federal air rules. And it's all happening through, of all things, an email-based request process. Critics say it's quietly rolled back some of the most significant Biden-era environmental protections.
An email-based system? That sounds almost too informal. Where did this even start?
It actually traces back to March 26, 2020, during the first Trump administration. According to the Associated Press and The Guardian, the EPA, then under Administrator Andrew Wheeler, issued a memo titled, quote, COVID-19 Implications for EPA's Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Program, end quote. It was framed as a temporary pandemic flexibility measure. But what it really did was create a blueprint for what experts are calling a regulatory self-determination model, where companies decide for themselves whether to follow the rules.
So how does that actually work in practice for these companies?
It's remarkably hands-off. Instead of going through a formal public filing or approval process, companies just document their reasons for non-compliance and notify the EPA by email. There's no centralized public registry, which means communities living near these plants often have no idea, in real time, if a local facility has stopped monitoring its hazardous emissions. ProPublica found that more than 3,000 facilities use the system, including major oil and gas refineries owned by ExxonMobil and Marathon, plus dozens of coal-fired power plants.
3,000 facilities is a stunning number. What kinds of monitoring were they skipping?
We're talking about leak detection, stack testing, and groundwater monitoring, the core safeguards that tell regulators and neighbors whether toxic chemicals are escaping into the air or water. And remember, this was originally pitched as a short-term pandemic accommodation. But the framework didn't go away. In March of last year, 2025, the administration revitalized and expanded the offer, this time to coal-fired power plants, chemical manufacturers, and other factories.
And now we're hearing a lot about ethylene oxide, or ETO. Why is that chemical at the center of this fight?
ETO is what the World Health Organization classifies as a Group 1 carcinogen, meaning it's known to cause cancer through inhalation. Back in 2024, the Biden EPA had finalized a rule tightening emission limits and requiring fence-lane monitoring at commercial sterilization facilities. The goal was to cut ETO emissions by 90%. But when the Trump administration came back into office, it issued waivers for nearly half of all U.S. commercial sterilizer facilities.
Half of them? On what legal grounds can the administration do that?
They're relying on Section 112, Subsection I, Paragraph 4 of the Clean Air Act. NPR and KFF Health News report, this provision lets the president exempt sources from hazardous air pollutant standards for up to 2 years if the technology is, quote, not available, end quote, and if the exemption serves, quote, national security interests, end quote. In Proclamation 10,959, the administration argued strict ETO limits would create a bottleneck in the medical device supply chain. They note that ETO is used to sterilize 50% of all U.S. medical devices.
That's a serious argument. Public health on both sides, really. And I understand the EPA administrator just took further action recently?
That's right. On March 17th of this year, about 7 weeks before today, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin proposed a draft rule to officially weaken those 2024 standards. So this isn't just temporary waivers anymore. It's a move to change the underlying rule itself. And that's part of what triggered the response we saw yesterday on Capitol Hill.
Tell us about that congressional pushback. Who's involved?
On May 8th, just 1 day before today, a coalition of lawmakers sent a formal letter to Administrator Zeldin. That includes U.S. Senators Tammy Duckworth, Dick Durbin, and Sheldon Whitehouse, along with Representative Brad Schneider. According to Senator Tammy Duckworth's official website, the letter urges the EPA to reinstate the 2024 rule. And their core argument is that the administration's claim of technological infeasibility just isn't true.
How are they backing that up?
They're pointing to what some are calling the Illinois proof of concept. Illinois passed something called the Matt-Haller Act, also known as SB 1852. That law has forced facilities like Medline in Waukegan and Vantage in Gurnee to slash their ETO emissions by 99.9%. These plants use what are called permanent total enclosure systems, along with multi-stage control devices. So the lawmakers argue the technology to meet, and even exceed, the federal 90% target is already up and running.
That seems like a strong counterpoint. What does industry say to that?
Industry groups, including AdvaMed and the American Chemistry Council, agree the technology exists, but they say it's not commercially viable for the entire national fleet of facilities. They estimate retrofitting older or smaller plants could cost upwards of $10 million per site. And they warn that could force up to 41 facilities to close, reducing U.S. sterilization capacity by 30 to 50%. So their framing is really about supply chain resilience and cost, not whether the engineering works.
And there's a courtroom dimension to all of this, too, isn't there?
Absolutely. Administrator Zeldin has leaned heavily on two recent Supreme Court rulings. The first is Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, which overturned what's known as Chevron deference. The second is West Virginia versus EPA, which established the major questions doctrine. Zeldin uses both to argue the 2024 Biden-era rules amounted to regulatory overreach that exceeded the agency's statutory authority.
But there are active lawsuits challenging the administration's position, correct?
Yes, several. One is Clean Air NC versus Trump, filed in January of this year. That suit argues the administration never actually provided evidence that emission control technology is unavailable, which they say makes the waivers ultra vires, meaning beyond legal authority. The second case is TEJAS versus Trump, filed by Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. That one challenges waivers granted to chemical manufacturers, and the Department of Justice has moved to dismiss it, arguing that presidential national security determinations aren't subject to judicial review at all.
That's a striking legal claim. Let's talk about the human stakes here. What does the science actually show about living near these plants?
The numbers are sobering. Back in 2023, reports found that long-term breathing of air near facilities like Sterigenics in Willowbrook, Illinois, significantly raised lifetime cancer risks. And a study from the University of Pennsylvania found that 11 of the 88 medical sterilizers in the U.S. elevated cancer risks in neighboring communities to more than 100 in a million. That's well above what the EPA traditionally considers acceptable.
And I understand ETO isn't the only chemical in the spotlight right now.
Right, there's also a parallel fight over forever chemicals, or PFAS. KFF Health News has reported that the administration is moving to soften Biden-era limits on PFAS in drinking water. The plan is to keep some standards for the most common PFAS, but rescind limits on rarer forms. And that's despite findings that these chemicals are linked to cardiovascular disease and low birth weight in babies.
So where do things stand right this moment, on May 9th?
As of today, Administrator Zeldin has not formally responded to that congressional letter sent yesterday. He continues to defend the EPA's pivot, saying the agency will prioritize, quote, economic demands, end quote, and, quote, efficiency, end quote, over what he characterizes as, quote, activist-driven, end quote, environmental justice initiatives. The public comment period for the ETO rollback closes on May 15th, so just 6 days from now, and a final determination is expected later this summer.
A lot of moving pieces, and clearly a story that's far from over. Chloe, thank you for breaking it all down for us this morning.
Always glad to be here, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. In Budapest, the political landscape is seeing a Magyar-nificent transformation, as Peter Magyar was sworn in as Prime Minister today, officially ending Viktor Orbán's 16-year tenure. The center-right Tisza party made quite a splash after reeling in a historic 141-seat supermajority during the April elections, leaving the Fidesz-KDNP coalition with just 52 seats. For the first time since 1990, Orbán will not hold a seat in the National Assembly, proving his influence has finally started flagging. This new government includes a record 54 women lawmakers and the first-ever Roma vice president of the Assembly. Following his 3 p.m. ceremony, Magyar will address a massive celebration at Kossuth Square, signaling a return to the European mainstream by restoring the European Union flag to the parliament facade. Hungary is clearly hungry for change, aiming to unlock 17 billion euros in frozen funds and lift the long-standing veto on aid to Ukraine. Turning to international waters, authorities are bracing for a wave of medical emergencies as the cruise ship MV Hondius prepares to dock in Tenerife on the morning of Sunday, May 10, 2026. The vessel is navigating a sea of troubles following a hantavirus outbreak that has claimed 3 lives. 6 cases of the rare Andes virus strain have been confirmed, prompting the World Health Organization to track passengers who disembarked at previous stops. More than 140 passengers and crew face a military-grade quarantine, but time is of the essence. A 24-hour weather window is the only thing keeping this situation from being dead in the water before shifting winds stall disembarkation for weeks. 23 countries are currently coordinating to retrieve their citizens before the tide turns. In the Caribbean, a new investigation is making waves as Puerto Rican lawmakers dive into a scandalous drugs for vote scheme. Allegations have surfaced that a prison gang known as the Sharks took a bite out of democracy by coercing inmates to vote for Governor Jennifer González Colón. Reports suggest the governor secured 83% of the inmate vote in exchange for narcotics, a revelation that has local leaders calling for a joint investigation. While some claim the report is just fishing for trouble, federal prosecutors are facing heat for allegedly being told to drop the bait on voter fraud charges. It remains to be seen if the administration can swim away from these accusations of political interference within the Justice Department. Closer to home, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey is trying to map out a new future for the state's elections. She recently signed legislation to set aside the results of the May 19 congressional primaries if federal courts permit the use of a contested Republican-drawn redistricting map. This plan hinges on the Supreme Court lifting an injunction, potentially allowing the state to revert to a map that critics say would draw a line under Black voting power. While the state argues they are just following legal precedent, opponents say the move is a clear attempt to hedge their bets. If the courts play ball, a special primary would be completed by August 26. Finally, ABC is in the hot seat as it battles the Federal Communications Commission over freedom of speech. The network accuses the administration of trying to chill the airwaves through regulatory pressure regarding whether the talk show The View violated equal time rules. Between threats to broadcast licenses and public calls for the firing of Jimmy Kimmel, the administration is making its point of view clear. Lead litigators say these actions create a harmful static for broadcasters, while the FCC claims they are just ensuring a level playing field. It is a high-stakes clash that could change the frequency of political commentary for years to come. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.